There is something quietly radical about choosing to stay home when the entire world seems to be rewarding those who never stop moving. We live in a culture that has built an almost religious devotion to busyness, where the fullness of your calendar has somehow become the measure of your worth as a human being. If you are constantly going out, constantly networking, constantly filling every hour with social engagements and visible productivity, you are celebrated. You are seen as ambitious, connected, and alive. But if you choose to stay in, if you pull back from the noise and the gatherings and the endless stream of social obligations, the world has a very specific set of labels waiting for you. You are called lazy. You are called antisocial. People begin to wonder something is wrong with you. If you are depressed, disconnected, or simply failing to keep up with the pace that modern life demands. This cultural narrative is so deeply embedded that many people have internalized it completely, feeling genuine guilt every time they choose rest over socializing, every time they close the door and simply breathe in the quiet of their own space. The glorification of busyness has made withdrawal feel like a personal failure, like a weakness that needs to be overcome, rather than a signal that deserves to be understood. But what if that signal is not a sign of failure at all? What if the pull toward home, toward stillness, toward solitude, is actually one of the most intelligent things your psyche can do for you? This is precisely where the work of Carl Jung becomes not just relevant but genuinely transformative. Jung was one of the most profound psychological thinkers of the 20th century, and his framework of analytical psychology offers a completely different way of understanding the human relationship with solitude and withdrawal. For Jung, the psyche was not simply a collection of conscious thoughts and behaviors. It was a vast, layered system that included the unconscious mind, the shadow self, the archetypes, and what he called the process of individuation, which is the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are at the deepest level. Jung understood that this journey cannot happen in noise. It cannot happen in the relentless outward movement that modern culture demands. Individuation requires turning inward. It requires what Jung described as a confrontation with the self, a willingness to sit with your own depths, to listen to what your inner world is trying to tell you. When the body and the psyche begin pulling you toward home, toward quiet, toward withdrawal from the social world, Jung would not have called that laziness. He would have recognized it as an intelligent signal, a communication from the deeper layers of your being that something important is happening inside you, something that needs space and silence to unfold properly. Jung observed throughout his clinical work and his own personal experience that there are seasons in a person's psychological life that demand retreat. These are not seasons of weakness. They're often seasons of profound transformation, moments when the old self is dissolving and something more authentic is trying to emerge. The desire to stay home during these periods is not disconnection from life. It is, in fact, a deeper form of engagement with life, an engagement that happens not on the surface of social performance, but in the interior landscape where real psychological growth takes root. The body knows this, the psyche knows this, and when they speak through the language of fatigue, through the longing for solitude, through the quiet but persistent desire to simply be home, they are not asking you to give up on the world, they are asking you to come back to yourself first. Now, it is important to be clear about what this exploration is and what it is not. This is not an invitation to permanent isolation. It is not a justification for avoiding life indefinitely or for using solitude as a shield against every form of human connection and responsibility. Jung himself was deeply engaged with the world, with his patients, his writing, his relationships. He understood that human beings are social creatures who need genuine connection. The point is not to abandon the world, but to recognize the difference between withdrawal, that is avoidance, and withdrawal, that is restoration. There are moments when staying home is the most psychologically beneficial choice you can make. Moments when your nervous system is overwhelmed, when your sense of self has become fragmented by too much external noise, when your inner life is calling out for attention that it simply cannot receive in the middle of constant social engagement. Learning to recognize those moments, to honor them without guilt, and to understand them through the lens of genuine psychological wisdom is what this conversation is truly about. Jung gave us a framework for understanding ourselves with far more depth and compassion than our culture typically allows, and that framework begins with taking seriously the wisdom of your own inner world. To understand why staying home can be one of the most psychologically significant choices a person makes, you first need to understand one of Carl Jung's most powerful and enduring concepts, the persona. Jung borrowed this word deliberately from the ancient Greek term for the masks worn by actors in theatrical performances, and the choice of that word was not accidental. It was precise. The persona, in Jungian psychology, is the psychological mask that every human being constructs in order to navigate social life. It is the version of yourself that you present to the world, shaped by the expectations of your family, your culture, your profession, and the countless social environments you move through every single day. The persona is not entirely false. It contains real elements of who you are, but it is always a selective presentation, always a curated version of the self that has been edited and adjusted to meet external demands. Jung was extraordinarily direct about the danger of over-identifying with this mask. He warned that the persona is what one is not, but what oneself and others think one is. Read that again slowly, because it contains something genuinely unsettling. The persona is what you are not, and yet most people spend the overwhelming majority of their waking lives living inside it, performing it, maintaining it, and slowly exhausting themselves in the process, without ever fully understanding why they feel so hollow at the end of the day. Every social environment you enter requires a slightly different version of the mask. At work, you wear the persona of the competent professional, measured, reliable, and appropriately ambitious. With friends, you might wear the persona of the easygoing companion, always ready with humor, always emotionally available. With family, there are often the oldest and most deeply grooved masks of all: the good child, the responsible one, the peacemaker, the one who holds everything together. Each of these personas requires energy to maintain. Each one demands that certain parts of you remain hidden, that certain feelings go unexpressed, that certain truths about your inner life stay carefully tucked away behind the appropriate social face. Over time, the cumulative weight of all this performance becomes genuinely crushing. Even when the individual moments of social engagement feel perfectly pleasant, the exhaustion is not always obvious. It accumulates quietly, like water rising in a room you have not been paying attention to, until one day you find yourself desperately wanting to simply be nowhere that anyone expects anything from you. This is a truth so universal that it appears not just in psychology, but in the oldest stories human beings have ever told. Consider Odin in Norse mythology, the Allfather, the supreme deity of the Norse pantheon, a figure of immense power, wisdom, and cosmic responsibility. Odin is the god of war, of poetry, of death, of knowledge. He carries the weight of all the 9 realms. He is the one to whom warriors pray, the one who decides the fates of battles, the one who sacrificed his own eye at the well of Mimir in pursuit of deeper wisdom. And yet even Odin returns to Asgard. Even the Allfather has a hall, a hearth, a space where the performance of divine authority can be set down, where he is not required to be the god of anything for a moment. The mythological imagination of our ancestors understood something that modern culture has largely forgotten, which is that every hero, every leader, every person who carries a significant role in the world needs a space where they do not have to perform any role at all. The return home is not a retreat from greatness. It is what makes greatness sustainable. This is not merely an abstract mythological truth. It lives in the real experiences of real people navigating real lives. Consider the story of a woman, a professional in her early 40s, who one particular autumn found herself doing something she could not entirely explain. She began canceling appointments, not because she was physically ill, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something inside her simply could not face another room full of expectations. She stopped replying to messages for days at a time. She stayed home, sometimes doing nothing more purposeful than sitting near a window and watching the light change. The people in her life were concerned. Some were quietly judgmental, but what was actually happening, as she later came to understand through her own process of reflection, was that her soul was forcing the mask to be set down. The persona she had been maintaining for years, the endlessly capable, endlessly available, endlessly composed version of herself, had reached its absolute limit. The withdrawal was not collapse. It was the psyche's own form of wisdom, creating the conditions under which something more authentic could finally breathe, finally surface, finally begin the slow and necessary work of remembering who she actually was beneath all the performances she had been giving for so long. There is a reason why certain emotions seem to ambush you most powerfully when you are alone and the noise of the world has finally gone quiet. You might notice it on a slow Sunday afternoon when there is nothing demanding your attention, or in the particular stillness of an evening when the social obligations have temporarily cleared and you find yourself sitting with feelings that seem to arrive from nowhere. A sudden wave of sadness without an obvious cause, an irritation that feels disproportionate to anything actually happening, a flicker of envy towards someone whose life seems to carry something yours does not. A fear so old and so familiar that you have almost stopped recognizing it as fear and started mistaking it for simply the way things are. These moments can feel uncomfortable, even alarming. The instinctive response for most people is to reach for distraction, to fill the silence with noise, to pick up the phone or turn on the television or find some reason to be busy again. But Carl Jung would have recognized these ambushing emotions not as problems to be silenced, but as messengers arriving from one of the most important and most misunderstood territories of the human psyche, the shadow. The shadow is one of Jung's most significant and most frequently misrepresented concepts. When people hear the word shadow in a psychological context, they often assume it refers exclusively to the darkest and most destructive impulses of human nature, the capacity for cruelty, for violence, for moral failure. And while those things can certainly be part of the shadow, Jung's actual definition was considerably broader and considerably more compassionate than that common misunderstanding suggests. The shadow in Jungian psychology is not simply the evil within us. It is everything that consciousness refuses to accept about itself. It is the collection of personality aspects, emotions, desires, fears, and even gifts and talents that the ego has decided are unacceptable, dangerous, shameful, or simply inconvenient to acknowledge. The fear of abandonment that you learned to bury because showing it made you feel weak. The anger that you swallowed for years because expressing it felt too threatening to the relationships you depended on. The envy you feel toward others that you immediately suppress because you have told yourself that good people do not feel envious. The creative longing, the unconventional desire, the part of you that wants something entirely different from the life you have constructed. All of these live in the shadow. None of them disappear simply because consciousness refuses to look at them. They go underground, and from underground they continue to shape your behavior, your relationships, and your emotional life in ways you cannot fully see or understand precisely because you are not looking at them directly. This is exactly what emerged in the therapeutic experience of a woman named Linda, whose case has been discussed within Jungian clinical contexts as a particularly clear illustration of how solitude activates the shadow. Linda came to therapy not because of any dramatic crisis, but because of something she described as an unexplained sadness that seemed to intensify whenever she was alone at home. She also noticed an irritation during quiet periods that she could not trace to any specific cause. Her initial interpretation of these feelings was that something was wrong with being alone, that solitude itself was somehow making her worse. But as her therapeutic work deepened, a different understanding began to emerge. The sadness and the irritation were not being created by her time at home. They had always been there, living beneath the surface of her busy, socially engaged daily life. The constant movement and social performance had been functioning as a covering, not a cure. When she stayed home and the covering fell away, what surfaced were emotions that had been waiting for exactly this kind of space to finally be acknowledged. Staying home did not create her shadow. It simply removed the conditions that had been keeping it hidden. Jung offered a statement that cuts directly to the heart of why this matters, and it is worth sitting with carefully. He said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is not a poetic abstraction. It is a practical psychological instruction. The path toward genuine wholeness and self-understanding does not run through the performance of positivity or the relentless projection of a composed and capable persona. It runs directly through the willingness to look at what you have been avoiding. And the home, the quiet, the stillness is where that looking becomes possible. When you notice that you feel inexplicably sad every time a particular kind of silence settles around you, that is a pattern worth following. When you recognize that a specific kind of solitude reliably brings up anger or grief or longing, those recurring emotional patterns are the shadow speaking in the only language available to it, which is the language of feeling. The darkness does not need to be feared. It needs to be made conscious. And the stillness of home is precisely where that consciousness can begin to grow. There is a particular kind of knowing that does not arrive through analysis or argument. It does not come from weighing evidence carefully or from consulting the opinions of people whose judgment you trust. It arrives differently, quietly, often at unexpected moments. A sudden clarity about a relationship that has been troubling you, an inexplicable certainty about a direction you need to take, the deep interior recognition that something in your life needs to change even before you can articulate precisely what or why. Most people have experienced this kind of knowing at some point, and most people have also learned to distrust it, to dismiss it as mere feeling or unfounded intuition, to override it with the more socially acceptable currency of logical reasoning and external validation. But Carl Jung would have pushed back against that dismissal with considerable force because in his framework of analytical psychology, intuition is not a vague or unreliable secondary process. It is one of the four fundamental psychological functions, standing alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation, as a complete and independent way of perceiving and processing reality. Jung defined intuition with a precision that separates it clearly from the casual way the word is often used. Intuition, in his framework, is the capacity to perceive what is coming into being, rather than only what has already become clear. This is a crucial distinction. Thinking works with what is already known, already defined, already available to conscious analysis. Intuition works at the edge of what is not yet fully formed, picking up signals from the deeper layers of the psyche, from the body, from the accumulated wisdom of experience that has not yet been translated into conscious thought. It is the function that allows you to sense the direction of something before the evidence has fully assembled itself, to recognize the truth of a situation before you can explain how you know it. This is not mysticism. It is a genuine psychological capacity. And like every psychological capacity, it requires specific conditions in order to function properly. And the condition it requires most fundamentally is one that modern life is extraordinarily reluctant to provide, which is quiet. The problem with constant social immersion is not simply that it is tiring, though it certainly is. The deeper problem is what it does to the interior landscape of the mind. Every social environment you enter demands a particular kind of cognitive engagement. You are reading faces, managing impressions, responding to conversational cues, navigating the unspoken emotional dynamics of the room, and simultaneously maintaining the appropriate version of your persona for that specific context. This is adaptive logic, the rapid, surface-level processing that social life requires in order to function smoothly. Adaptive logic is genuinely useful. It keeps relationships running and social situations manageable, but it operates at a frequency that effectively drowns out the quieter signal of intuition. When the mind is constantly occupied with the quick reactions and social calculations that external engagement demands, the deeper perceptual function simply cannot get through. It is like trying to hear a whispered conversation in the middle of a crowded and noisy room. The whisper is still happening. The information is still there, but the conditions make it functionally inaccessible. Staying home reverses this dynamic naturally and without effort. When the social noise recedes, when the demands of adaptive logic temporarily lift, the mind begins to settle into a different register, one where the quieter and more profound signals of intuition can finally rise into consciousness. This is not only a Jungian insight. Modern psychological research has been building a compelling body of evidence that connects directly to what Jung understood intuitively about the relationship between solitude and deeper self-knowledge. Researchers studying interoceptive awareness, which is the capacity to accurately perceive and interpret the internal signals of your own body and emotional state, have found that this capacity is significantly strengthened by regular periods of low stimulation and solitude. People who have meaningful and consistent time alone, time that is not filled with screens or social performance or external demands, demonstrate a measurably greater ability to make decisions that are genuinely aligned with their deeper personal needs, rather than decisions driven by social pressure, habitual patterns, or the desire to meet external expectations. They are better at knowing what they actually want, what actually matters to them, and what direction actually serves their authentic well-being. This is precisely what Jung was describing when he spoke of intuition as a function that perceives what is coming into being: the home, the quiet room, the unhurried morning without obligations. These are not empty spaces. They are the conditions under which the psyche's most sophisticated perceptual capacity can finally do its work, bringing into consciousness the knowledge that has been forming in the depths all along, waiting patiently for the noise to stop so that it could finally be heard clearly and acted upon with genuine understanding. There is a concept in Jungian psychology that most people have never encountered by name, but that virtually every person has experienced in their body, in their bones, in the particular kind of exhaustion that sleep alone does not seem to fix. Jung used the term psychological libido to describe something far broader and more fundamental than the biological instinct that Freud had originally associated with the word. For Jung, libido was the life force itself, the total energetic currency of the inner world, the animating power that drives not just sexual desire, but every form of human motivation, creativity, curiosity, emotional engagement, and relational investment. It is the energy behind your enthusiasm when you are genuinely excited about something, the force behind your capacity to care deeply about another person, the resource that makes it possible for you to show up fully in your work, your relationships, and your own interior life. And like every form of energy in the natural world, psychological libido operates according to a fundamental principle of balance. It can be directed outward, invested in the world, given to relationships and roles and social performances, and the endless demands of external life. But it must also be allowed to return, to replenish, to flow back inward through rest and solitude, and the kind of quiet that allows the inner world to restore itself. When the outward direction continues without adequate recovery conditions, when the energy keeps flowing out without anything flowing back in, the result is not simply tiredness. It is a dangerous imbalance that affects the entire psychological system, dimming the capacity for genuine feeling, narrowing the range of authentic response, and leaving a person functioning on a kind of energetic debt that accumulates silently until the cost becomes impossible to ignore. The story of a man named Henry illustrates this depletion with a clarity that is almost painful in its familiarity. Henry was a viewer who shared his experience, and what he described was not a dramatic breakdown or a visible crisis. It was something quieter and in many ways more insidious. Henry was the person that everyone leaned on. At work, he was the colleague who absorbed the anxieties and frustrations of the people around him, the one who listened when others needed to process their stress, the one who stayed calm when the environment became tense and offered steadying words when others felt overwhelmed. With his friends, he played a similar role, always available, always willing to set aside whatever he was carrying in order to hold space for what someone else needed. In his family, the pattern was oldest and deepest of all: the reliable one, the emotionally available one, the person whose own needs had somehow never quite made it to the center of any conversation. Henry had been functioning as an emotional container for virtually every significant relationship in his life, and he had been doing it for so long that it had simply become his identity, the role so thoroughly fused with his persona that he had largely stopped noticing the weight of it. Then came a specific moment that cracked something open. He was sitting with his phone, reading through a group chat with people he considered close friends, and he watched the conversation move through everyone's updates, everyone's needs, everyone's plans, and he realized with a sudden and devastating clarity that no one had asked how he was doing in longer than he could remember. He was present in every conversation as a resource, as a support, as a function, but not as a living and tired human being who might himself be running empty. That moment of recognition did not produce anger. It produced a grief so quiet and so complete that he simply put the phone down, sat in the stillness of his apartment, and did not reach for anything or anyone for the rest of that evening. What Henry was experiencing has a name in modern psychological research. Emotional resource depletion and attention fatigue describe the measurable deterioration of cognitive and emotional functioning that occurs when a person's internal reserves are continuously drawn upon without adequate restoration. Research in this area has consistently demonstrated that the nervous system requires genuine low stimulation periods in order to shift out of the activated, outward-facing state that social engagement demands and into the parasympathetic recovery mode, where actual restoration becomes possible. This is not metaphorical. It is physiological. The body and the psyche are not separate systems, and the depletion that Jung described in terms of psychological libido is the same depletion that neuroscience now maps in terms of cortisol levels, attentional bandwidth, and autonomic nervous system regulation. Staying home. Genuinely staying home in an environment of low stimulation and reduced social demand is one of the most direct ways to initiate this recovery. It is how energetic sovereignty is restored, how the life force finds its way back to center, and how a person like Henry begins the slow and necessary process of becoming not just a resource for others, but a living, replenished, fully present human being for himself. There is a journey that Carl Jung believed every human being is quietly invited to undertake. Not a journey across physical geography, but a journey inward toward the deepest and most authentic layers of who a person actually is beneath all the conditioning, all the inherited expectations, all the unconscious patterns absorbed from family and culture, and the relentless pressure of collective life. Jung called this journey individuation, and it is perhaps the most important concept in his entire body of work, as well as one of the most consistently misunderstood. Individuation is not about becoming special. It is not about separating yourself from society or declaring yourself too evolved for ordinary human connection. Jung was explicit about this distinction. Individuation is the process by which a person gradually frees themselves from the unconscious domination of the collective in order to live closer to their true psychological structure. The key word in that definition is unconscious. Most people are not living their own lives in any deeply meaningful sense. They are living the life that was handed to them, shaped by the expectations of parents, the values of their culture, the roles assigned to them before they were old enough to question whether those roles actually fit. Individuation is the slow and often uncomfortable process of becoming conscious of all of this, of separating what is genuinely yours from what was simply installed in you, and of gradually building a life that reflects your actual psychological nature rather than the collective template you inherited without choosing it. What makes this relevant to the experience of staying home is that individuation does not happen in noise. It does not happen in the middle of constant social performance or in the relentless outward movement that modern culture rewards. It happens in the spaces between, in the quiet, in the withdrawal, in the moments when the external world temporarily recedes and the interior world becomes audible. And this is not a modern psychological invention. It is a pattern so ancient and so universal that it appears in the mythological imagination of virtually every human culture that has ever existed, which is precisely why Jung regarded mythological patterns as maps of deep psychological processes rather than merely entertaining stories from the past. The hero who must enter the cave before claiming the treasure, the prophet who withdraws into the desert before returning with genuine wisdom, the warrior who spends time alone on the mountain before descending as someone truly capable of leading. These are not arbitrary narrative details. They are the collective human imagination encoding a psychological truth that our ancestors understood in their bones, which is that genuine transformation requires a period of withdrawal from the ordinary world. The cave, the desert, the mountain. These are the ancient symbols of the same interior space that a quiet home provides in the context of modern life. When you feel the pull to stay in, to cancel the plans, to close the door on the social world for a period of time, you are not failing to participate in life. You are following a pattern as old as human consciousness itself, the pattern of necessary withdrawal that precedes genuine becoming. There is a paradox at the heart of the individuation process that Jung found deeply significant. And that becomes increasingly apparent the further a person travels along this inward journey. The paradox is this: the more deeply a person comes to understand themselves, the less compelled they feel to prove themselves. This might sound simple, but its implications are profound. Most of the frantic outward movement of modern life, the constant social engagement, the relentless performance of capability and likability and success, is driven not by genuine desire, but by unconscious need, the need to be seen, to be validated, to confirm through the reactions of others that you are acceptable, that you are enough, that your existence has value. These needs are not shameful. They are deeply human, but they are also, in Jung's framework, signs of a self that is not yet fully individuated, a self that is still dependent on the collective mirror to know what it is. As individuation deepens, as a person develops a more genuine and stable relationship with their own psychological nature, this dependency gradually loosens. The validation of others becomes less urgently necessary because the inner relationship with oneself has become more real, more trustworthy, more sustaining. And this is the gift that the withdrawal makes possible. The person who returns to the world after genuine periods of inward attention returns not as someone driven by unconscious reaction, not as someone performing a persona in desperate hope of approval, but as someone capable of genuine choice, someone who engages with others from a place of authentic presence rather than anxious need, someone who has become, in the truest sense of Jung's vision, more fully and freely themselves. What you have traveled through in this exploration is not a collection of separate ideas loosely gathered around the theme of staying home. It is a single, unified psychological journey, mapped through the extraordinary depth of Carl Jung's framework. And it is worth pausing to see the whole shape of it before moving forward. The journey began with the persona, that carefully constructed psychological mask that every human being builds in order to navigate the demands of social life. You learned that the persona is not who you are, but what you and others have agreed to believe you are, and that the exhaustion of maintaining it across every social environment you inhabit is real, cumulative, and significant. Staying home creates the first and most essential condition of psychological recovery, which is the space to set the mask down, to stop performing, to exist for a period of time without the weight of any role or expectation pressing against you. This is not laziness. This is the beginning of honesty with yourself. From the persona, the journey moved deeper into the territory of the shadow, those repressed and unacknowledged aspects of personality that consciousness has decided are too uncomfortable, too threatening, or too inconvenient to accept. The fear that you buried because it made you feel weak. The anger you swallowed to keep the peace. The envy you suppressed because you believed good people did not feel such things. The gifts and longings you set aside because they did not fit the life you were expected to build. The shadow does not disappear when it is ignored. It goes underground and continues shaping your life from a place you cannot see. The stillness of home removes the coverings that constant social engagement provides, allowing these hidden parts to surface, not to overwhelm you, but to be finally seen, finally acknowledged, finally integrated into a more complete and honest understanding of who you are. Jung told us that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, and the quiet of home is precisely where that consciousness becomes possible. The journey then turned toward intuition, Jung's fourth psychological function, the capacity to perceive what is coming into being before it has fully assembled itself into conscious thought. You learn that constant social immersion forces the mind into adaptive logic and quick reaction, effectively drowning out the quieter and more profound signal of intuitive knowing. The low stimulation environment of home reverses this dynamic, allowing the deeper perceptual layers of the psyche to rise into awareness, bringing with them the clarity about relationships, directions, and decisions that no amount of external consultation can reliably provide. Modern research on interoceptive awareness confirms what Jung understood, that people who have genuine periods of solitude make decisions more aligned with their authentic needs, because they have developed the interior listening that makes such alignment possible. From intuition, the journey moved into the territory of psychological libido, Jung's concept of the life force that animates the entire inner world. You encountered Henry's story and recognized in it something that many people carry without fully naming: the depletion that comes from functioning as an emotional resource for everyone around you, while no one thinks to ask how you are doing. You learned that this depletion is not a personal weakness, but a predictable consequence of continuous outward energy expenditure without adequate recovery conditions, and that the home environment, in its simplicity and its quiet, is one of the most direct pathways back to energetic restoration and genuine self-sovereignty. And finally, the journey arrived at individuation itself. Jung's vision of the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are at the deepest psychological level. You learn that the desire to withdraw, to stay home during pivotal phases of inner transformation, is not a failure of social engagement but an intelligent signal from the psyche that something important is reorganizing itself within you. The ancient mythological patterns confirm this truth across every culture that has ever existed. The withdrawal precedes the becoming. The cave comes before the treasure, the desert comes before the wisdom, and the quiet home, in the context of modern life, is where this ancient and necessary process continues to unfold. Jung's core insight, the one that runs beneath all 5 of these dimensions like a single underground river, is that staying home in its apparent simplicity is where a person stops living by collective reflexes and begins living by the guidance of the self. It is where you stop performing and start listening. It is where you stop losing yourself to the noise and begin, slowly and genuinely, finding yourself within the quiet. This channel exists to continue that exploration with you, to keep traveling into the quiet depths of the human psyche, where silence is not emptiness and withdrawal is not failure, but the beginning of something far more real. If this journey has resonated with something in you, leave your reflection in the comments below, because your experience matters here. Like this video if it has offered you something worth carrying. Subscribe so that the next exploration finds you. And know that whatever drew you to this content today was not accidental. It was your own inner world, already beginning to ask for exactly the kind of attention it deserves.